Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. So we're up to chapter 10, and as I mentioned, I think we're going to be able to do 10 and 11 today. They're kind of somewhat connected, and the themes are not super lengthy in either one. So I think we'll work out well. So what are we up to? We're up to like this. We went already through the whole discussion of explaining the two souls, the operation, the structure of each of them. We talked a little bit about how the interaction of the souls with things in the world, with reality. We talked about the realm of the permissible, the realm of the prohibited, the associations, how to be able to elevate things, the impact that the associations that the soul has with reality, the impact that it has on the soul, how to retroactively remedy and re-elevate things that maybe were not elevated at first interaction. Even talked about the power of teshuvah, of repentance, that could free and elevate even the area of the forbidden, of the prohibited. And we talked about the description somewhat last week on what that conflict looks like inside of us. The two kings who are trying to fight over the control over one city. You only have one body, you only have one brain and one heart. And the two forces that are fighting and battling with each other to take full control of the driver's seat. We're moving kind of now towards getting into more specific and deeper understanding on what the conflict looks like for the Beinoni, for the in-betweener, which is essentially what each of us are striving towards. And then we're going to get into very, very practical guidance on how to deal with it step by step in all different areas of what that will affect. Practical ideas, things to do, perspectives, understandings, meditations, a lot of very, very tangible guidance on how to be able to deal with all that. But before we jump back into that whole direction, the Alter Rebbe is taking us back for a moment to a discussion that was referenced in the first chapter. In the first chapter, we talked about the general principle of how we have the tzaddik, the Beinoni, and the rasha. And we gave a very general definition then. The common understanding of what a tzaddik is, or who a tzaddik is, and who a Beinoni is, and who a rasha is not necessarily accurate. Commonly, the understanding is that a tzaddik is someone who's mostly good, a rasha is someone who's mostly bad, and a Beinoni is someone who's kind of half and half. And we explained that can't be the case, and already then we kind of established the concept that tzaddik is perfect, rasha is someone who sins even once, and a Beinoni who's someone who never sins but has the struggle, so he's imperfect inside, perfect outside, meaning in his expressions. Now we already have a little more terminology for that. In the garments, the thought, speech, and action, the Beinoni is perfect, like the tzaddik, but in the inside, meaning in the intellect and the emotions, he's struggling because the animal soul and the godly soul are both still fully present, fully active, fully in power, and challenging each other for control. However, the Beinoni is the one who's always able to make sure that in execution, when it comes to the actual thought, the speech, and the action, the godly soul is the one who always dominates. Fine. So that's the general concept. Now, we're going to get back into that and be able to start to analyze a little deeper what exactly does that mean and what does it look like. And if that's really the case, how many of us are even on the path of Beinoni? Like, this seems like so elevated. It's like seems like such a high degree. So we're going to get to all of that. But in order to be able to appreciate the understanding of that in the greatest extent, the Alter Rebbe takes us back first to analyze and explain a little more specifically what the tzaddik and the rasha is. And that's what's happening now in chapter 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is analyzing the tzaddik, and chapter 11, the rasha. And then in chapter 12, it's going to get into the Beinoni, and from there it's basically going to, through the end of Tanya, chapter 53, it's going to be all about the Beinoni. So now that we have a better understanding on the structure of the souls, and we understand at least the system and how things look like inside, we can come back to the topic of tzaddik, and we can come back to the topic of rasha, and have a deeper analysis and appreciation to the fine nuances of what that means. And although tzaddik is likely foreign to most of us, and we explained even chapter 1 when we talked about it, that it's not necessarily even by our choice, because if God doesn't designate somebody to be a tzaddik, no matter how hard you'll try, you can never become a tzaddik. It's either you are or you're not. It's a gift that God gives a person. But in order to be able to appreciate the struggle and the understanding of the Beinoni, we need to understand what the tzaddik is. And as we'll soon see, it's not just understanding it, it also establishes a certain standard, or at least a perspective of a goal, of what it is that we're aiming for. What is it that we're trying to reach? Although we're not trying to be a tzaddik, but we're trying to reach certain qualities that the tzaddik possesses naturally. So by understanding the tzaddik, we can appreciate that a little better. And the same as well, when it comes to the rasha, we want to be able to understand it better. What exactly is the rasha? What are the different levels? Although obviously our goal is not to remain in the realm of rasha, we want to strive for Beinoni, but understanding who the rasha is and what the rasha is also helps us know what we're dealing with and what we're trying to leave from and where we're trying to get to. So that's going to be the focus for today with God's help. So when it comes to the tzaddik, in chapter 1 there was a reference that explained that there are two general levels in the tzaddik itself. We have what's called tzaddik gamur, complete, total tzaddik, and tzaddik she'eino gamur. A tzaddik that's not, it's like a raw medium tzaddik. There's one that's fully baked, and one that's not complete. But a tzaddik is a tzaddik. So what does it mean? A tzaddik gamur, a complete tzaddik, and tzaddik she'eino gamur, a tzaddik that's not complete, that's not finished, that's not completed. So essentially, we already explained and we already understand that when it comes to the godly soul and the animal soul, their drives, their interests, their motivations are very, very different, right? The godly soul is all about God, and the animal soul is all about self. It's all about what's me, what do I like. It's all self-centered. One is God-centered and one is self-centered. And we explained that ultimately the tzaddik is the one that basically has been able to completely conquer his animal soul. You can't say he doesn't have an animal soul, because if you don't have an animal soul, you don't have the force of vigor in your physical body. He has the soul, but the animal soul has been completely conquered and transformed into godliness. So he doesn't have the struggle of the animal soul. His animal soul has been transformed. There's only a godly instinct within the tzaddik's innards. The tzaddik doesn't have desires, temptations, interests in things that are not godly. He doesn't have to struggle. I have a pull now. I have an interest for something that shouldn't be, and I have to overcome that. He doesn't have it. It doesn't exist. It doesn't start. It's a tzaddik gamur. But now we're saying that there's gamur and no gamur. So we want to understand, right? What exactly does that mean in these two levels? So even in the tzaddik that doesn't have the animal soul, or the animal soul has been completely transformed, he could still be eino gamur. He could still be not full. What does that mean? So ultimately, when you're looking at the person from the outside, you'd never be able to tell. Even the Beinoni and the tzaddik, it's hard to tell them apart. Because we already understand now that the Beinoni is one who never, in expression, meaning in thought, speech, and action, never violates the godly soul's direction. So even a Beinoni to a tzaddik, it's hard to tell them apart on the outside, at the surface. And obviously, that much more so between the tzaddik gamur, the complete tzaddik, and the tzaddik sheino gamur, it's even more difficult and basically impossible to tell them apart on the surface from the outside, if you're looking at them from the outside. But inside, there is a difference. And in some ways, that difference will also be expressive on their outside too, but you have to know about it to detect that. What is the essential difference? So the essential difference is, think of it if we're looking at this in the realm of a physical conflict. If you have an enemy force that is fighting against you, and you're trying to overcome it, you want to silence, eliminate the enemy. So if you apply certain tactics, you're able to overcome the enemy. Let's say if you're talking about a war, a conflict in that sense, if you have a stronger military, if you have better policies, you may be able to overcome the enemy. But even when you overcome the enemy, there are two ways on how that can be established, how that can come together. One manner is that you have exercised so much strength that the enemy has become completely overwhelmed by the strength that you have demonstrated and you have exercised. And as a result, the enemy is completely silenced. It's not happening. They're not even coming back. It's over. But technically, they're still there, meaning the presence of the enemy is still there, but it's so totally silenced that there's zero threat from the enemy whatsoever. Their expression, their attitude, their ideals are non-existent. There's no expression of it. Say if you're dealing with an enemy, maybe they may have influence in how they indoctrinate people or how they try to impose certain views and perspectives that are contrary to the values or the ideals of your space. So none of that is happening. There are no expressions of that. There's no indoctrination of any form whatsoever. There's zero threat. There's really no concern about the enemy anymore. But technically, the forces that were once the enemy, they're still there. They haven't gone anywhere. They're just totally overwhelmed by the exercise of strength that you've demonstrated, that they're silenced. That's one level. A second level, which is an even greater degree of overcoming the enemy, is that not only you've silenced the enemy, but you've completely transformed. And perhaps even those individuals or powers that were once fighting against you are now part of your team. They become allies. They're working with you. And so it's not only that there's no threat, the enemy has been completely transformed now, that it's actually working alongside with your team. That's a much greater achievement in conquering the enemy. So in the realm of the tzaddik, what that means is as follows. The animal soul, let's just say for practical purposes, is the enemy of the godly soul in the context of this discussion. Which means that the animal soul has its own interests, has its own pulls that are against and contrary to the godly souls. Now, the tzaddik has exercised such strength with expression of the godly soul to the point that the animal soul has become eliminated. And again, it doesn't mean the soul itself, but the expressions, the self-directed expressions of the animal soul are gone. They don't exist. They don't show up anymore. They're not being expressed in any way, not in thought, not in speech, not in action. It's gone. It's even inside. There's not even the desire for it. It doesn't even initiate. But the tzaddik, sheino gamur, means that technically it's still there. It's just not coming up anymore. Because the power of the godly soul has become so strong that it's totally overwhelmed any interests of the animal soul. It's totally silenced. That's the tzaddik she'ino gamur. He's not complete. Meaning, he's a tzaddik. He's completely overwhelmed as animal soul. But he's called eino gamur because technically the aspects of the animal soul could still exist, but they're overwhelmed totally. The tzaddik gamur has reached a point that not only he's succeeded in silencing the expressions and the desires and the initiations and the attempts of the animal soul, but now all the power and the strength of the animal soul has been transformed to become powers of the godly soul. Let me give a practical example of what that means so you can understand a little more, what the idea is. One of the big differences, and we talked about this, I think, last week a little bit, between the godly soul and the animal soul, is that the animal soul is driven by instinct because it's animalistic. So the source, the root of the animal soul is emotions, although it has an intellectual process as well. But primarily, the animal soul functions in a manner that it begins with emotions, and then it uses the intellect to justify or to achieve the goals of the emotions. The godly soul is structured in a manner that intellect is at the top. The godly soul's headquarters is in the brain. That's what we spoke about last week. So that means the process of how the godly soul functions is it starts with the mind, and then it inspires emotions, and then it motivates, drives the person to execute whatever it is, the ideas and the emotions that have been expressed. Now, typically, we would say that this system, the godly soul system, is a healthier, it's a better, more functional system. However, there is a certain disadvantage in the godly soul system, and that is that it's a little too quiet. It doesn't have that much fire and passion. It's boring. I mean, it's good, it's perfect, but it's very calm. It's maybe a little too calm. The system where the headquarters is in the heart, which is the animal soul, and it begins with emotions, could be very corrupt and could be very misled. But one advantage that it has is that it's on fire. So let's take that concept now and apply that to the service of God, of the tzaddik, who's operating exclusively by the functions of the godly soul. So the tzaddik is serving God. What does that mean? That in the mind of the tzaddik, all that is being processed, all that he's intellectualizing are godly ideas. And that is inspiring emotions for God in the heart of the tzaddik. Love for God, fear, reverence, respect of God. Okay, great. And that will motivate, that will inspire actions, thoughts, speech, and so on. But if the tzaddik is operating only by the model of the godly soul, such a tzaddik is going to be a very perfect individual outside and inside, but he's not going to be on fire because his animal soul has just been silenced. It hasn't been conquered. It's just been silenced. And all he uses to operate is the godly soul. So his style of operation is going to be very, very calm, relaxed, kind of quiet. But once the tzaddik succeeds to become gamur, complete, that he's actually transformed the animal soul and conquered it, so now the animal soul becomes an agent of the godly soul. So it brings its characteristics, its style into the picture. Now suddenly you have a tzaddik whose mind is only filled with godliness, his heart is only filled with godliness, his thought, speech, and action is all godliness, but he has also the style and the temperament of the animal soul, which is very highly emotionally passionate. So this tzaddik's love for God is going to be on steroids. It's going to be on fire compared to the tzaddik sheino gamur. They both love God, but one loves God like he's ready to shoot out into space. The other one, okay, I love God. It's just more calm and tame.
So charisma comes from the animal soul. And when it's tamed the right way, then he can be used,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not about trying to get rid of the qualities of the animal soul, but it's about redirecting it.
Yeah.
But the first step is to conquer it. You can't redirect something that's fighting against you. Now, like I said before, although we're not necessarily in the track for tzaddik, but when we understand this concept, that principle, like you just mentioned now, is something that we're going to learn later on. We're going to see that in the struggles of the Beinoni, this concept is going to become to use as well, because we're going to learn to appreciate that certain aspects of our inner struggle in the Beinoni, who hasn't conquered the animal soul. The animal soul is alive and well. I mean, if you give it one opportunity, it will take you to the deep end, right? It's ready to drive you completely to the path of self, nothing to do with God. So although the Beinoni is still dealing with that struggle in a very real way, understanding that there are certain benefits in the approach or in the temperament, in the style of the animal soul, helps us have a better appreciation. It adds meaning to the struggle. That we can understand that although we're struggling and sometimes we fall because of the struggle, sometimes it doesn't work out exactly how we hoped and we feel disappointed, we have regrets, we feel guilty or whatever it may be, it adds meaning to say, but there's a certain value to this. It's not like, I wish I was just a tzaddik. I wish I didn't have to deal with this animal soul. God, just take the animal soul away from me. Let me just have a godly soul. Once we understand this concept, we can appreciate that there's meaning to it. And therefore, we can continue to approach the struggle with greater motivation and more empowered sense. It gives us more hope, more desire to continue constantly re-engaging in the conflict, re-engaging in the inner battle that we have to struggle with. So that's in general, when we talk about the tzaddik, we talk about these two levels. The tzaddik gamur and the tzaddik sheino gamur. So again, just to summarize, the tzaddik has completely conquered, defeated his animal soul. There is no expression of the animal soul within the tzaddik, even inside, in any way whatsoever. And there is not even a threat or concern that could exist, because he's completely conquered it. He's silenced his animal soul. However, there is a difference in 2 degrees of the tzaddik, 2 levels of a tzaddik. One that has not only silenced it, but actually transformed now the animal soul to become an agent, to become an ally of the godly soul. And the one who's not complete has just silenced it, but hasn't transformed it. That's chapter 10. Go ahead.
So the tzaddik Gamor, who has completely silenced the animal soul.
And transformed it.
Oh.
They both silenced it.
Okay.
But one has transformed it, meaning now he's actually applying some of the styles, the qualities, the characteristics of the animal soul in his service of God. And the other one just silenced it, but
right.
He's still operating.
That's the Gamor is the one that
Gamor who was transformed, yes.
So the other one, but the animal soul you talked about is being, us needing to survive and eat and things like that. So if it's silenced, then he or she is, I guess it's he in this case, or is not taking care of their body?
No. Great question. The answer is no.
Okay.
Because when we're talking about silencing it, we're not talking about the actual function, meaning the blood is still flowing, right? You're still eating, you still have nutrients, and that all technically operates through the system of the animal soul. But the animal soul is not in any way expressing itself, not in the mind, not in the heart, not in the garments. None of its expressions in the soul powers of it, in the spiritual powers of it, are existent in the physical body. So now let's talk about, for a moment, about the rasha. So there's a teaching in the Talmud that states that the following: Afilu poshe Israel, even the most sinful individuals among the Jewish people, meleim mitzvot kerimon. They're filled with mitzvot, with positive deeds, like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. So the story is told that once two Hasidim of two different groups met together, and they were talking. And one Chassid expressed that his Rebbe shared that he had a question on that passage of the Talmud. And basically the question was, he says, if they're sinners, how could the Talmud say that they're filled with mitzvot? They're sinners. So what does it mean? How could it be that they're filled with mitzvot? So the other Chassid said, interesting that that's the question your Rebbe presented, because my Rebbe also presented a question on that passage, but his question was different. His question was, if they're filled with mitzvot, why does the Talmud classify them as Poshe Israel, as sinners? So, anyways, the point of the story is to show it's all about perspective, right? You can be talking about the same thing, and it's about the perspective. And when it comes to the rasha, which we already understand, we explained earlier, the rasha is somebody who falls, who does something they shouldn't do. It's not just inside, it's not just an idea that came up, a temptation, but actually in one of the levels of the garment, whether it's in thought, speech, or action, the rasha exercised a behavior that is not appropriate, that should have not happened, that should have not been. And even once, that person is in the category of rasha for that regard. So what benefit or what opportunity does a person like that have at the table? We're coming to Pesach, and we're going to talk about the four sons. We have the Chacham, the wise. We have the Rasha, the wicked. He's at the table. But what presence does he have at the table if they're not considered part of the system, if they're not considered part of the community, then how are they even part of the discussion? So what's the significance of the Rasha when we're talking about an individual that is doing things he shouldn't do? And interestingly, when it comes to the Rasha as well, in chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe referenced from the Talmud, that we have also two categories of the Rasha. Just like in the Tzaddik, we had the Tzaddik Gamur, and the Tzaddik Sheino Gamur, the complete Tzaddik, and the one that's not complete. In the Rasha, we also have two categories. It's actually described in a little different terminology, but similar concept. We have what's called a Rasha V'tov Lo, a wicked, and it's good for him. And then we have the Rasha V'ra Lo, the Rasha, and it's bad for him.
Can you say that again?
Rasha V'tov Lo, it's good for him. Rasha V'ra Lo, Ra, like bad, evil.
Not good for him.
Yeah.
Okay. So meaning, well, I'm sure you'll get into it, but meaning the evil that's good for him is something that helps him learn.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that. Yeah. One way of understanding it in a simple way is to say you have people who are wicked and they still have a good life, and then people who are wicked and they don't have a good life. right? It kind of gets us into the big question. Why does it seem like God's not always fair, right? You see righteous people suffering, you see wicked people prospering. Job asked the question. It's a age-old question that many people want to try to understand the ways of Hashem. So typically, when you understand that terminology, we understand it in that sense. But here the Alter Rebbe is going to take us in a deeper understanding of it, not necessarily about what kind of life the rasha has, but actually on what's going on inside of the individual. It's two categories of wickedness, if we could say, or an individual who fails, but how that affects them. So let's talk about the rasha v'tov lo. The rasha v'tov lo, as the Alter Rebbe explains, is basically a person who is considered rasha because they failed, they have done things they should have not done. However, they still have good in him. He still has good inside of him. What does it mean he still has good inside of him? It doesn't mean that he still has a godly soul, because any rasha still has a godly soul. No matter how far a person may have gone, no matter how wicked a person may become, they don't lose their godly soul. You can't lose it. You can't get rid of it. So they always have good in him. But here we're not talking about the good in the sense of the godly soul, but we're talking about good even in the sense of the innards, meaning his intellect, his emotions. He still has active expressions of the godly soul inside of him. And even in the context of the expression that was inappropriate, whether it was in the thought, speech, or action, that led him to the category of rasha, even in that context, he still has good in him. What does that mean? One example of that is that a person may do something they shouldn't do, but then they later regret it. That's a good sign. That's a good sign. Sometimes we feel, I have regrets, I live with guilt, I have to go to my therapist to figure out how to overcome issues of guilt. Not every guilt you have to get rid of. Some guilt is very good, it's very healthy, it's very positive. Sometimes to feel regretful is a good thing. Obviously, if it haunts you to the point that you can't operate, you can't function, you have to learn how to be able to channel that regret and guilt in a way that's going to be functional. But the guilt in itself, the remorse in itself, is a very positive thing. It's a good thing. That's an example of something that we called good. The rasha still has good in him, meaning he still understands that what he did is not good. His values haven't been compromised. Maybe he doesn't have the inner strength to always do the right thing, but at least he knows what's right and wrong, and he cares about what's right and wrong. It bothers him. If he said something to somebody he should have not said, he may say it again, but at least he feels bad later. He may not apologize, but inside at least he feels bad. He knows he said something he should have not said. The rasha veralo is in really bad shape. It's bad for meaning he doesn't have the good in him anymore. He doesn't even regret it. He's okay with it. He could do the sin and he's happy with it. It's okay, I can live with it. Not a problem. Doesn't bother me. He's gotten comfortable in the skin of the sinner. Now, it doesn't mean he doesn't have good, like I said. He still has a godly soul. And even such a rasha, even such a wicked could come back, could somehow reconnect. Obviously, it's going to be more work, greater effort. Still has hope. Nobody's ever, written off completely. But certainly, he's got a lot less to work with. In this context, it's probably a lot easier for many of us to be able to identify in these levels, right? We're talking about that certain things that maybe we know for ourselves in our own life. Somewhere in our consciousness, if we're really pushed against the wall, we can admit that maybe a certain value is really the right way to live, or it's the true way, it's the correct approach. But we've gotten so comfortable with not living in that way that we've justified it with whatever it is, and it's okay. It doesn't bother me anymore. Not uncomfortable with it. And then there are certain things that we're so accepting, we're so aware of its inappropriateness that although we may not always 100% live up to it, but it really bothers us that we don't. Meaning, it sits in our heart, that emotion, that guilt, and in our consciousness, we feel that, we carry it with us. And that's the difference between the rasha v'tov lo and the rasha v'ralo. And the wicked that's good, that has the good, and the wicked that doesn't have the good. They're both wicked, meaning they're both not fulfilling the expectations in its fullest. And here we're not talking about frequency, of how often a person does what they shouldn't do. It could be even once. But in that context, in that one time, there could be two ways on how they react to that. One is, I'm comfortable with it, and one is, it's bothering me. I'm filled with regret. Even if that doesn't move me enough to make sure I don't do it again, but I'm still filled with regret. So that's already a level. That's already a higher level. It's already a better situation, right? So that's the general context. That makes sense? I want to read a few lines here so we can understand in the terminology of the Alter Rebbe to appreciate the nuances. Okay, so I'm going to read just the English to make it simple. So there's a verse in Ecclesiastes in Kohelet that says God has made one opposite the other. Zeh le'umat zeh. The rasha who has it good, which is the incomplete rasha. Here, the incomplete is the better one, right? He's not a complete rasha, he's the incomplete rasha. Is the conceptual opposite of the tzaddik who has it bad, the incomplete tzaddik. As we have learned in the previous chapter, the incomplete tzaddik is overwhelmingly good. The minuscule amount of evil that remains in him is effectively voided by the abundance of good, right? That was a tzaddik, sheino gamur. He's not complete. Still has technically the evil in it, but it's been completely silenced. Corresponding to him is the rasha who has it good, the incomplete rasha. Which means he has good, but it's hidden because overwhelmingly, at least in that moment, in that particular detail, the evil has dominated, which is why he's doing it. He's continually repeating this behavior. This means that in the incomplete rasha, the good in his divine soul, found both in his brain and the right chamber of his heart, is at least to some extent suppressed and voided by the evil in the left chamber of his heart, which comes from klipa. Just as the status of the incomplete tzaddik is subdivided into many sub-levels, this status too of incomplete rasha is subdivided into many tens of thousands of different levels, depending on the extent to which the good is suppressed and voided by the evil, quantitatively and qualitatively, God forbid. So that means what I just described to you is a very general category. In that itself, it can have many degrees. There are people who feel the regret in a more active way, some that have a very small, little, minuscule regret still left. So there's tens of thousands of levels in that area in itself. For example, at one extreme, there's the person whose good is suppressed and voided by his evil to a minuscule extent. And even then, it might not be a permanent state or even a common one at frequent intervals. And only on rare occasions will the evil in him overwhelm the good, conquering his body, the small city. And even then, his evil may not conquer all of his body, but only part of it, which will obey the whim of his evil. So that means this is a person who is barely a rasha. Very infrequently does the evil finally take over. And even when it does, it's very temporarily. It's just a small little thing you should have not done. That's like the best case scenario rasha, right? The incomplete rasha may be overcome by his evil only rarely and to a minimal extent. Nevertheless, at that moment, he becomes a vehicle and garment for evil, which becomes dressed in one of his animal soul's three garments of thought, speech, and action mentioned above. And then he goes on to say, for the high-end, incomplete rasha, who has only a minuscule amount of evil in his animal soul, it will probably not take long before he regrets what he did. Afterwards, the good in his divine soul will overwhelm him, and he will regret what he did and request God's forgiveness and pardon, and God will definitely forgive him. So that's like the best case rasha. But then he says there's also the person whose evil overwhelms him more strongly. And in contrast to the mild rasha, who may just sin in one area of thought, speech, or action, in this more severe case, evil is dressed in all three garments of thought, speech, and action. And in contrast to the mild rasha, who occasionally commits minor sins, this more severe rasha is overwhelmed by his evil, causing him to commit more serious sins more frequently. Nevertheless, even with this rasha, this influence of his evil side is incomplete, and the good within him will surface too, which is, but between bouts of sin, who will experience remorse, and thoughts of repentance will enter his mind, from the good within the soul, which gathers a little strength in the periods between. So this person sins more often, but he also has regrets. So at least he's still incomplete in that sense. But somebody says, but a person who never feels remorse and does not have any thoughts of repentance at all is classified as a rasha who has it bad. In this case, the evil in his animal soul is all that remains as having influence within him. He still has good, he still has the godly soul, but it's totally asleep. His godly soul never expresses itself. He doesn't even feel any regret. He's totally comfortable in living his life in the sinful manner. For the evil has so overwhelmed the good that it has caused the good to depart from inside him, and good now has no role in his inner life. Of course, this doesn't mean that he has actually lost his divine soul. It is only that its influence has been banished. His good still exists, hovering above his body, but it does not penetrate him. And it's interesting, he quotes here, this is why the sages of blessed memory said, over every 10, the divine presence rests. So I want to close with reflecting on this last comment here. I think it's very powerful. And just like when we talked in chapter 10, the aspects of the tzaddik that seem maybe a little out of reach, we still said that it has meaning and relevance to the struggle of the Beinoni, which is what we're going to get into the next discussion. This also has meaning, even if we feel like, this lowest level of rasha is like, so, thank God I'm not there, so I don't need to worry about it. There's still relevance and meaning in understanding that reality, because it's going to have an impact in our personal struggle as well. This idea that even the rasha, which is bad for him, meaning that he's gone so far out, he doesn't even have regret. He's always doing the wrong thing. He has no expression of the godly soul whatsoever. Still, we say that he has a godly soul. That's a very powerful element. To the point that the Talmud says that when 10 Jews gather together, the divine presence rests over them automatically. It doesn't matter what they're doing. 10 Jews are together, it has a certain spiritual force, a certain spiritual power, even if we're not engaging in a spiritual activity. You can be sitting at the baseball game, 10 Jews together, you have a stronger frequency of the divine presence with you. Knowing about that can empower us to if there's 10 Jews together, we better use that as also an opportunity to do something good, right? But this principle applies no matter who those 10 Jews are. Even if among them there's a rasha, and a rasha to that extent, it still happens. That force still present in the same way if it was 10 tzaddikim.
Does that apply to a minion? Because it's 10.
That has to do with why a minion. Yes, it does have to do with that. But it doesn't have, in this context, it's not minion related. It doesn't have to be men. It doesn't have to, it's 10 Jews. 10 godly souls. Why? Because when the godly souls are together, it creates a certain force of divine power. So even this rasha veralo, the wicked that's bad for him, because that individual still possesses the godly soul, although it's not in any way expressing itself within the individual, it exists in a way kind of like hovering. It's almost like it's associated with the individual, but it's not active. So therefore, that still helps that when it's combined with another 9 godly souls, it's going to have that effect of the power of the 10 godly souls. Equally, whether it was even if it was like a tzaddik. That says a lot. That says a lot about the power of the godly soul. That says a lot about the power of a Jew. This could be a great source of hope for this rasha in that level, that they can somehow eventually still be turned around. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort. But if for whatever reason we're perhaps engaging somebody in that level, we can know that all hope is not lost. And there's always an opportunity to be able to reconnect them. Somehow, you have to find a way to give even a minuscule chance for the godly soul to express itself in some manner within that individual. And slowly but surely you can start to get more involved and bring more influence. But also for ourselves, to know for our own sake, that in the areas of our life, that maybe perhaps there are certain parts of our life that we feel we have gotten into the realm of this lowest level rasha. Like I explained before, it doesn't have to mean that in every aspect of my life. Maybe there's certain things that I've done, that I've gotten associated with, that become so justified in my mind that I'm like so okay with it that I don't even regret it. It doesn't bother me. It's in my consciousness, it's come to the point that it's allowed. This is fine. It's not a problem. This is totally okay. Now, if you push me to the wall and you challenge me to debate you to prove that it's okay, I know I'm going to lose because, deep down in my consciousness, I know it's really not okay. But I have justified it so much that I'm totally cool with it. Even in that regard, there's still a chance for the godly soul there. It's still somehow connected. There's still an opportunity. Yes?
So, given that all of this, especially was written a couple hundred years ago, and it's very based in observance of Judaism, so observance of the mitzvot and all these things. So is it considered rasha let's say like you're in deeds, actions, and words,
Thoughts.
thank you. You're pure, but you're not, adhering necessarily to the 613 mitzvot, and you're not davening how many times a day you're supposed to, or you're not doing all the things. How does that sit?
So,
or is that a huge part of the whole thing?
the definition of good and bad could be very, very subjective. How do we define good and bad? You bring 10 people together in a room and you ask them to define good and bad, you can have 10 different perspectives, and many of which are going to conflict. For one person's good is the other person's bad, and one person's bad is the other person's good. So if we're going to define good and bad just by our own subjective views, we'll never be able to get to the real core of what really is the definition of good and bad. So our vocabulary, or our frame of reference to be able to define these terms in the most absolute way is how God defines them. God's definition of good and bad is what he communicates to us in the Torah. Now, that doesn't mean that a person who, you gave an example of davening, let's use that as an example, praying. So somebody who is lacking in their frequency of prayer, they missed a prayer. Is that good? It's not good. It's bad, because, that's the definition of the Torah. Now, does that mean that that person is a bad person? Does it mean that that person is disconnected from God, or has no place at the table, so to speak, to have an association with a godly soul? Of course not. I mean, this is part of what we're learning. But in that regard, yes, that would be classified as bad versus good. Anything that the Torah describes to us, the 613 mitzvot, those are the good, and anything outside of that is not the good, right? And that's why earlier on in chapter 4, for example, when we talked about the expressions of the godly soul, the thought, speech, and action of the godly soul, it's all about the Torah and the mitzvot. The godly soul doesn't express anything that's not in that realm. And even the things that it does in the physical sense, you asked earlier, if the tzaddik doesn't have an animal soul, does he eat, right? So of course the tzaddik eats, but the tzaddik eats as the godly soul eats. How does the godly soul eat? It's not only that he eats kosher food, but the manner and how the tzaddik approaches the eating is with the perspective of God. He eats what he feels he needs to be able to be connected with God. He's only going to eat what he needs. He's not going to eat in indulgence. He's not going to eat something that's not healthy. Because he doesn't need it. He only eats what he needs. He doesn't have a temptation just for food because I like it. It tastes good. It looks good. I want it. The tzaddik doesn't have that realm. So of course, he's still living life, physical life, but every action, every expression of even the physical aspects of his life are all within the influence of the godly soul. Anything outside of that is the animal soul. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to work towards that. Now, in a practical sense, if we're talking about, a practical roadmap, how do I work towards this? It doesn't mean that these concepts and these teachings are not relevant to me if I'm not, currently living what's supposedly considered a orthodox observant life, or B, if at least I plan to do that, then if I'm not fitting into either one of those two, maybe I should close this book. It's not relevant to me, no. Because in the context of halakha, of Jewish law, the appropriate roadmap for any Jew, no matter where their level of observance may be, is that we need to know what is right and wrong, meaning we need to know the definitions of what the Torah tells us is good or not good. And then we need to make practical steps towards that are appropriate within the context of our circumstances of life. That's what's expected halachically. So say, for example, a person who wasn't raised observant, and at some point later in their life, they become more interested in connecting with Torah mitzvah. Is the halachic expectation that person, today forward, I'm going to observe all 613 mitzvot? No. It's not practical. It's not realistic. It's not achievable. What is the expectation? Every day, make a step forward. Whatever the step is, it doesn't have to be a giant step. Work towards that. And not because I'm working towards that, so eventually I'm going to get there. Even if you never get to the perfect observance, if there is such a thing. Even if you don't get to that, it doesn't mean that you failed. Because the course of your relationship with God is your personal journey in that direction. So if you're challenging the question directly to say, if I didn't pray the afternoon prayer, was that good or bad? The answer is it's bad. It can't be good. But was that expected of me today? Not necessarily. So the discussion and all the insight that teaching provides for us is relevant to me in my level or in my progress of my personal journey, wherever it is, bless you, wherever it is that I'm up to right now. Even though technically some of the definitions are absolute, you can't say it's good not to pray the afternoon prayer, even though it may not be something that's technically expected of me today because of where I am in my journey. You can't say it's good. It's not good. Because that's the good and the bad is absolute. It's defined by the Torah's view.
Oh, yeah.